You go first.
No,
I
you say dumb
think
stuff.
I'm going that way.
Sorry. Thank you. Yeah, you know. You blow this up a bit. There we go.
Okay, welcome back. So what we're going to do right now is a Q&A with Amanda. I pulled the questions from the back, and then we also have a microphone so we can do questions from the crowd. And then after that, we are going to end our day together in the way that we started. With some worship, some inspiration. It'll be short but sweet, and send us out to the world. Because as I said, today is step 1A. And I know that just visiting the different educational offerings we had this afternoon, that nobody got even closely, no one got close to being done, right? And that just tells us something that we have some more work to do. That's our commitment to you. So I'm going to just introduce myself again, Jeremy Langell, the Executive Minister of the Council of Churches. And as we go along in this Q&A, I'm going to say a little bit about what that means. Some of you may or may not know what exactly it is that we do. But before we do that, I want to get started with at least one question. This is a general theme that has come up in the question box. So why is the title Christians Against Christian Nationalism if what we're talking about is something that is fundamentally not Christian?
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that question to explain. And yeah, sometimes I start there, but wanted to get to the meat of the presentation today. So that's the name we gave to the campaign in 2019 when we started the work. And the way that the project started actually came about months earlier with the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue. And that being only the latest, sadly, in a very long line of violence at and around houses of worship. And this idea that if religious freedom means anything in this country, it should mean that we can gather in houses of worship and meeting houses and temples and synagogues and mosques without the fear of deadly violence. And so we started in an interfaith table to talk about what we're going to do about it. And it really started as, okay, well, what if Christians could say about the threat of Christian nationalism, and Jews could say something, and Muslims could say something, and our interfaith colleagues very politely listened, and then said, we agree with you that this is an urgent problem. It is killing people in our country, and we think you Christians are the ones that need to take this on. For a number of reasons. One, and they said this very kindly, but this is really mostly your problem. And the research since then has borne this out, right? We saw the different breakdown in different groups. They said, too, we know that this isn't what the teachings of Jesus reflect. We know that this isn't really what Christianity is all about. But you as Christians can explain that with more authenticity and knowledge and conviction than we can. And so we think that your voice on this is really important. And three, they said we simply do not feel safe to call out Christian nationalism with the force that it needs to be called out in this country right now. And so that was the mandate to actually call it Christians Against Christian Nationalism. So that's the Christians part. The against part, some people, often someone will say, can we just not say what we're for? Why do we always have to be against things? And I hear that. And if you actually go to the statement of principles, you'll see a lot of those are for statements in the unifying values. But we thought it was very important to clearly name Christian nationalism and to come out forcefully against it. That was a step one. And then the step two is building the kind of society of things that we're for, and that would be, I don't think I knew all this at the time, or we didn't know it at the time, but that we've since seen that that's going to be borne out through the kind of community organizing that we think is a key to this, is that we will discern what we are for based on actually doing the work in community. And why then call it Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism if it really doesn't have anything to do with Christianity? why kind of, there's an argument that it gives too much to associate Christian with Christian nationalism. And I hear that argument, but I think I also want to name, as I did earlier, that it is, as wonderful as it would be to say Christian nationalism has nothing to do with Christianity, I don't think that's a truthful statement, given the centuries that Christianity, European Christianity, American Christianity have sacrificed, as I said earlier, our gospel of love on the altar of power. And the ways that Christianity itself has been infected by Christian nationalism, I think that it's inaccurate to say that Christian nationalism has nothing to do with Christianity. And then I've also been, everyone has parsed this name everywhere. Then people say, well, why not call it Christo-fascism? That nationalism is too soft, and that it would be more, and it would be more accurate to call it fascism is what I've heard the most, but I've heard other variations. And I think that's accurate, but I do think that the fascism piece of it, which is definitely present, is an extreme part of Christian nationalism. There are some what I call softer forms of Christian nationalism that are also pervasive and pernicious, that if we just focus on the most extreme, that it kind of lets the more soft, sympathetic forms of Christian nationalism, it lets us off the hook too much. And so I think we need to be looking at all. No name's perfect. I'm always looking for different, but that's the idea behind the names of the words that we chose.
Excellent, thank you. Along those lines, especially with your legal expertise, one of the questions here that I think is really helpful is asking about whether or not Christian nationalism is the driving force behind the upcoming SCOTUS case on religious charter schools. And maybe this brings together two of your areas of expertise. Someone can say something about that.
So a little background for who didn't write the question or isn't as up on the latest Supreme Court cases. One of the cases on this term's docket comes out of the state of Oklahoma, where there was an effort to establish, first of its kind, religious public charter school. Okay, so charter schools are public schools in the state of Oklahoma and defined as such. And that effort was ruled unconstitutional by the state Supreme Court of Oklahoma. Not a bastion of liberalism, right? State Supreme Court of Oklahoma interpreting both the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, but also their own state constitution. Because their state constitution has a clause that says that public schools will not be sectarian. Basically, that public schools can't be religious. And this is a foundational constitutional value of the United States that then was shared in a lot of the state constitutions. All the way back to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, that they made a deliberate choice to make a break from established religion, that public funding would no longer go to support religion. And religious schools teach religion, right? They should, right? That's the whole purpose of having religious schools, is to indoctrinate into the religion. But they should not, under the constitutional order, receive public money to do so. And so I do believe that Christian nationalism is an ideology that undergirds this assault on public education, an assault that has been two-pronged. I talked about the efforts to Christianize public schools by infiltrating the curriculum, the language, the kind of government-sponsored religious exercise in public schools. But there is also a concerted effort to privatize education and turn it over to religious schools. And we see that with voucher proposals that are both at the federal but also at a number of state and local levels. But this effort in Oklahoma is another step to actually say that public schools can be religious, right? That the religions can actually set up public schools. So the state Supreme Court ruled this unconstitutional. The Attorney General of the state of Oklahoma, who is a Republican, also came out very strongly to say that to come out against this program. And so it is a very concerning development that the Supreme Court decided to take this case. Now, you don't have, I think it's 4 votes, that you need 4 votes to take a case. You need 5 votes to win, right? So just because they took the case does not mean that they're going to hold it constitutional. But given the way that this court has interpreted the First Amendment, I believe in a very distorted way in recent cases, to say that to treat religion differently when it comes to public funding is to discriminate against religion. There's a lot of cases that they have said that, and there is a majority on the court who has adopted that view. I think that if they were to apply that principle here, that this is a really concerning trend. And Baptist Joint Committee, BJC, we are filing a friend of the court brief in this case in the coming weeks on the principle that this is unconstitutional, and to explain more from a faith-based perspective why to do so is actually to be in support of religion and religious freedom, is to say no public support for religion, but we'll see how it goes. And I'll put in a plug for the podcast that I co-host with BJC's General Counsel, Holly Holman. It's called Respecting Religion. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts. And we will be talking in coming weeks, particularly about this case, analyzing the oral arguments, and then talking about eventual decision in the case as well.
So this is a good segue into talking about what the council does, and then I'm going to push a question back to you. So many of you might know I'm just one in a long history of executive ministers. I'm so grateful that my colleagues, my predecessors, whose shadow I stand in, Jim Miller, Donnie Anderson, John Holt is not here. But these are folks who have long understood the importance of being people of faith in the public sphere. And so part of what we do, and you may or may not know this, so we advocate for our values as Christians in the public sphere, and we do that by not telling someone that you have to think like me as a Christian. That's not what we do. But if we're taking a view on immigration, so for example, the Council of Churches in Rhode Island is the only Rhode Island institution that is one of the 27 plaintiffs suing the Trump administration, or DHS, over the violation of rescission of sensitive locations. So that's work that we do, right? And we do that because our congregations are under threat. So for us, it's not this would be a fun policy thing to do. This is, our congregations are directly impacted, not just congregations that provide social services in immigrant communities, but who in fact have members who are undocumented immigrants. So that's an example of something that we do. When we're at the State House this Wednesday, we have a hearing on the assault weapons ban. And this is something the Council of Churches has been working a long time on with many other folks to get that across the aisle. And we show up as people of faith, right? Rooted in the house of love. We don't live in the house of fear, we live in the house of love. And we're going to advocate for these kinds of issues. Freedom to read. This is a plug, right? Outside. And over here we've got information. The freedom to read is legislation that the council has been very active in defending that protects libraries and protects librarians from partisan attack, from book banning and censorship and so forth. So what we do is we take these broader issues in society and we partner with our secular partners. We partner with 9 judicatory bodies, denominational bodies in Rhode Island. So we do that work, and then our job is to then work with you all, right? To get you there, but also to hear from you, where do we need to go? All right. So that's one way that the Council of Churches talks about how we show up in terms of faith-based advocacy. Now, look, the question is, there's a series of questions about this idea, is how to do that. And also, what do you do when you're accused of preaching politics in the pulpit, which I am regularly accused of. Nearly every place I preach something and someone has a comment for me at the end, which is fine. I'm happy to answer that question. Right? So what do you think about that? When we have this kind of maybe mythological view in America that Sunday morning is not for anything other than whatever it is you do on Sunday morning, right? But that when we start actually saying, well, wait a minute, if we vacate the sphere, we need to get back in, well, is the pulpit a place for that? And how do we do that?
Yeah. So, yes, I get this question a lot, so much so that we made a little 4-minute video on our website that's kind of an explainer on this very topic. And one of the questions, so particularly on preaching, I think we have to be careful about talking about the difference between being political and being partisan. Right? And the partisan piece really gets to a legal requirement that has to do with tax status. This is where everyone's eyes start glazing over. So, houses of worship, for the most part, are considered 501c3 organizations, which is kind of the most favored tax status. Okay, and so you get the so not only are houses of worship not, their income isn't taxed, but contributions are tax deductible. And part of the deal with being a 501c3 is that you agree not to engage in partisan activity, not to intervene in, is the actual legal word, not to intervene in any for or against any candidate for public office, right? And so it exempt from that are ballot initiatives and campaigns like that. So that's not part of it. But if you do that, then you may risk your 501c3 status. Now, actually, it is an incredibly under-enforced provision, so there's not much of an actual legal threat. I'm not advising. I think it is actually a very bad idea to engage in partisan preaching because no candidate, no political party aligns perfectly with our theology. And if it does, then I think we're worshiping something other than God, right? That it should not align. And so we should not be partisan. But that doesn't mean we should be political. And I would argue that Jesus was quite political when we think about being involved in the life of our community. How do we speak up for our neighbors? How do we show love for our neighbors by advocating for or against policies that are impacting their lives? How do we understand our faith in the context in which we live in, right? Because I do think it becomes quite irrelevant if we don't understand how to apply our faith to our lives outside the walls of the church. And sometimes, as you know, within the life of our church, with regard to the sensitive locations policy that has been rescinded and that churches are pushing back against. So I think that difference, and again, where that line falls is something that needs to be carefully attuned, right? And we need to be careful in the ways, and not just careful in a legalistic sense, but careful in an integrous sense, that we're not using the pulpit in partisan ways, but really speaking to the pressing issues and concerns of our communities, and applying our understanding of our religion, our religious text, and how our faith is informing our political action. Which I then think turns to the first part of the question. Should I go there? With how we engage in faith-based advocacy in responsible ways. Because what we don't want to do, and I think that this is something, again, to be attentive to, that faith-based advocacy is not just us showing up for policies that we like, right? and just trying to push and put our theological views into law and policy. We can be informed by our faith, and then that informs how we care about the issues, but the actual policies are going to be equally beneficial and helpful for people without regard to religion, right? What we don't want to do is somehow legislate or make religious laws. I think that's kind of maybe a more direct way to put that. And one could imagine, I'm not coming up with an example right off the top of my head, but one can imagine how advocacy could actually push to being a religious law, something that is unique to a particular religious faith and is not shared by all. There are examples from our past, for instance, of what they call Sunday blue laws, right? Where there was particular emphasis and protection given for Sundays in order to protect Christian worship. And not all Christians, of course, worship on Sunday, but most do, in a way that was really kind of, why Sunday above other days? It's a form of Christian supremacy or kind of something that's informed by a particular religious view or practice. And so we want to shy away from that. But that doesn't mean, as that question from the survey pointed out, it doesn't mean that when we advocate, we are maybe advocating for laws that reflect Christian values, but values that aren't always exclusively Christian. So let me give you kind of an applied example from one I've already used a couple of times today. The curriculum in Texas that teaches religion to kids as a way that, while they're teaching them to read. One of the particularly egregious examples was a kindergarten lesson where they were using the story of Goldilocks. And somehow they kind of pigeonholed into the story of Goldilocks, teaching the golden rule. But the way they taught the golden rule is they said the golden rule comes from Jesus. Jesus went up on a small mountain and started a sermon. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. It is in the Gospel of Matthew. And then they proceed to have the King James Version of this, and it's all about teaching, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that's what Goldilocks is about. Like, it doesn't even make logical sense, right? And one of the objections that we raised is, one, this is just using this story as a vehicle to try to teach in a devotional way, a Christian text, to kindergartners who cannot tell the difference between a religious claim and a fact claim, and for whom their kindergarten teacher is one of the primary positions of authority in their life. And anyway, lots of ways it's interfering with this child's religious freedom and their family's religious freedom. But we also pointed out the golden rule is not exclusive to Christianity. It's not like Jesus just came up with the golden rule, during the Sermon on the Mount. And in fact, that lesson is inherent in so many different world faith traditions. And so one way that our advocacy made a difference is now in that version of the story, they at least say the golden rule is also found in other faith traditions. So in some, that wasn't what we were pushing for, but at least, I guess they made the lesson marginally better in that way. But I think that is an example to say, as we advocate for our values, where can we look to see that this is what inspires me out of my unique faith tradition, but that this is something that is actually a universal value that will help our entire society regardless of religious affiliation or identity.
So this is the unique position that the Council in Rhode Island holds, because we also, I think, have claimed the legacy of Roger Williams to some degree, and I think that infuses our work. And so when we show up to advocate for the separation of church and state, we really mean that, and we mean that also from a religious view. So now another question, which I think if we all look around the room, this was a great question. There was a notice that there weren't many young folks here today, and that's okay. So the question is, well, what do we do about that? Now, my bias, of course, prior to here, I worked in youth ministry for a long time. I actually worked at the church that was sued by the IRS during Bush's administration, All Saints Pasadena. We were accused of violating our 501c3 status. We were accused of endorsing a candidate. We did not. That was an interesting time, right? Yeah. So how do we bring that into the room? What's the reality? How does this legacy, how does this work need to include another generation? But then how does that need to transform us? What do we any kind of thoughts or wisdom about how we work?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of public speaking on this topic, and I will say that you as an audience are pretty typical of the audiences that I have. Now, I think there's actually quite a big, as I look out at this crowd, I think we do have some age diversity in this room, so I don't think, but if we think about young people, what do we mean by young people? right? Is that high school students, college students, millennials, where are we talking? I guess millennials are actually getting a little older now. Gen Z, like where are we actually, like, what are we thinking about a target? And I think the other is, I don't know how many people in those groups come to a lot of all-day public lectures and conferences on topics like these. And so I think when we think about reaching people, we have to think about a lot of different ways to do so, ways that we can invite people in. I will say, one aspect is thinking about a digital campaign. Now, we do have, at Christians Against Christian Nationalism, we have a TikTok channel. And when we started the TikTok channel, we had a Gen Z digital native who started it and who did the content for it. And it does reach people in a unique way. I will say, as in my Gen X self, that I think we need to find ways to go from online to offline engagement, right? That we need to not just stay in the digital space, but how do we provide pipelines to get more directly involved in in-person activity? And finding leaders who can do that work effectively, I think, is part of the campaign. So as we do organizing, how do we identify youth leaders, like in our communities, and ask them to create things that will reach populations that they are in already, and not think that something that other generations create is going to be automatically interesting to the next generation. I do think there is a lot of opportunity. I mean, you see youth activism in a lot of places.
Which you should do.
And, this is a complicated and nuanced topic, but we see it in protests on college campuses, right? And we see the way that those protests have been really targeted for a chilling effect on free speech. And so how do we take some of that enthusiasm, and how do we support them in that activism, in expressing First Amendment rights in ways that don't cause threats to other people, right? And I think that's the nuance and the complicated piece here, is that there on those campuses, there was both anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim discrimination. And how do we understand and not pit communities against each other? And how do we encourage the kind of activism and not, rightfully recognize what's happening right now with the detention of some of these activists who are not citizens but who have legal permanent status, how that is directly meant to try to chill future protest activity, and how do we help come alongside and support that kind of protest activity. We don't necessarily, people in this room don't necessarily have to be the ones engaging in the protest, but how do we help protect those who are engaging in the protest?
That's a really good question. Yeah. My mind is wondering about how our local churches are going to get involved in this too, in terms of where that next generation of leadership is coming from. I'm going to take a moment and see if there is anyone out in the crowd that has a burning question. Question, not a comment, a question. And then I've got a couple more up here.
Can I add one thing while we're walking? When you say how can our churches be involved, I want to plant a seed of something that we've been talking with some people in the labor movement around. Is in this moment, both with what's happening around sensitive locations, what's happening with other actions against immigrants in this country, how do we train this generation, I mean that like people of all ages, but our generation in the actions of nonviolent direct action? And can some of those trainings, maybe this has already happening, can some of those trainings happen in houses of worship?
It's not already happening, and I think it needs to be. And I only mention that as a pretty good check mark by it, because that's one of the pieces that Dr. King talks about, right? Before you get to, after you negotiate, right, which you have to do, you have to pick up the phone and say, can we have a conversation first, if you can. Then there's a process of getting ready for the next step. And that's often a process that we skip. We just want to go straight to And I understand the urge to go straight to the action, but there's this piece here that Dr. King talks about that is embedded in this tradition of nonviolence. How are you internally preparing yourself, and how is your community preparing itself for what's to come?
And I would guess, especially in a community like this, if your churches started hosting trainings on nonviolent direct action, that young people would show up and maybe could actually lead the trainings, right? And that would be a way to engage new generations in the work that's being done.
Yeah. Oh.
I just wanted to say the slides that, the slides that we've been shown, can they be made available to us? Because I don't write that fast.
I can certainly make mine available, and
I will collect everything and get it to you.
Hallelujah.
I'll try to make this a question, not a comment.
Community college in Rhode Island has Center for Nonviolence. They do trainings.
Great.
Thank you.
I'll try to make this a question and not a comment. Is it our goal when we talk about youth in this work to get them into our faith community, or is it our job to get after them?
Oh yeah, no, and I wasn't suggesting, I think yes, I think, is it our job to bring youth into our faith communities, or is it our job to go to the youth? And I think it's our job to go to the youth, right? And like I said, to support the activism that's happening. If we're truly participating in our democracy, then we're building communities across all different kinds of difference, including age difference. And so to understand and respect youth leadership, I think, is a crucial piece of that, including the Rhode Island College trainings on nonviolence.
CCR.
Okay.
Just curious about what we're doing in the state council churches in terms of working with organizations like Dorcas Place. This is a Rhode Island question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so,
Because if you're talking about,
sure. So the question is, what are we doing at the council level with folks like Dorcas? Which provides, Dorcas provides services for immigrant communities. So the Council of Churches, I'll take it, let me just say something about myself here. I'm technically part-time. Tracy can ask you or tell you that I spend a little bit more hours than I should be. So what that means is we are partners with many organizations. So for example, I'm on the steering committee for the Interfaith Coalition to Reduce Poverty. We are represented on the Immigration Coalition, Rhode Island Immigration Coalition. And we have several commissioners that attend those meetings and do that work. So in all of the places where we have secular partners, and in many of these places, we're often the only religious group there. So whether we're working on, last year, for example, we were very involved in getting the legislation passed that protects doctors from being sued from out of state for providing reproductive services. So often the Council of Churches, we're in terms of, religious voices there, but not exclusively. So on, the question, so we do work with Dorcas, and what we've learned, I would say, since January 20th, is many of our partners, especially partners who do refugee work, are under a tremendous amount of stress, which I think is obvious, is easy to talk about because they've lost federal funding, right? So part of that is how do we continue to support them as we can, right? But then how do we chart a new path forward? We have congregations asking for Know Your Rights trainings. And historically, those are partnerships that would have done that work for us, right? But there's a lot of stress in that system. Well, Monday night, I was at a thing with the Attorney General, and at the end of that conversation, I met his policy chief of staff, and we talked about, could the Attorney General do trainings for churches on Know Your Rights that are faith-based? And I said, yes. Because I always ask Susie, I always say yes. This is part of the problem. So, to respond is, we're in those partnerships, we're at the table, we always have some at the table, we have a reporting structure, so, things get lifted to me and Randy. Randy is a saint in the Council of Churches. He's our communications person and does a tremendous amount of work as a volunteer. And we're also recognizing that some of those historic models and relationships are changing. So how do we continue to support while change? So I would say it's a both and, right? I don't know if that answers your question in a satisfactory sense, but it's a challenge. It's a challenging time right now. If you have someone in your life who works in an agency dependent on federal funding, it is a challenging time.
And I'll just put in a plug for separation of church and state. Because houses of worship don't take federal funding, we are again in a position where we are able to speak out more forcefully than a lot of these other organizations find that they're able to do in this moment.
Hi, Amanda. This is Angela, Poor People's Campaign. One of the things you said, I don't exactly want to disagree with you, but I kind of do.
Sure.
Because you said all people in this room do not have to be out there in the streets. I want you to know you need to be in the streets. And we will try to make sure you know when things are happening in the streets. And I just want to know how you feel about that, because it's okay to to tell people, don't worry about it. The young ones will take care of it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. No, thank you for the clarifications. I think, did you mean to say just let the young people protest and you don't have to be out there? I think what I meant and what I said earlier was that every person has to be more actively engaged in the project of democracy than we ever have before. And I do think that there are lots of ways to be actively involved that are not only attending a protest. And I think that we also have so many different issues out right now that part of what we have to discern is what is my piece to do, right? Because I think what I meant is not everyone needs to go to a campus protest about human rights abuses in Gaza, right? Like that's like, I'm just like being specific, right? But that there are others, there's so many different issues. And it's like, how are you going to plug in and take your piece? And to think, because there are moments, I'll be honest, over the last several weeks, that I'll find out about something new that's going on, and I'll feel this sense of how am I not already working on this issue, right? And then I'm thinking, okay, don't think so highly of yourself. There are a lot of other people out there, and we have to trust that other people are going to be leading the way on a number of different issues. And so I think part of it is a coordination and a collaboration and building up large communities of people who can speak out in mass ways against the multiple, infringements on democracy and freedom and dignity that we're sensing right now in this moment. Because the overwhelm, and we've been focusing a lot on federal strategy, but as someone who's coming from Texas, and I know there are things happening in Rhode Island here too, it's multi-layered. It's also happening on state and local levels too. And so the overwhelm is part of the strategy. It's supposed to kind of create this sense of helplessness, this idea that the problem is too big and too vast for any one person to do anything about it. And the truth it is too big and too vast for any one person to do anything about it, but it's not for all of us together. I learned from an expert on autocracy recently that something to keep in mind is that the autocrats are less powerful than they think they are, and we are more powerful than we think we are, right? And so to keep that in mind and to discern which is our piece is really what I meant to say. Thank you.
And one really good example, again, a practical example of this in Rhode Island, as Randy's looking around the room, the Freedom to Read campaign, which the council is really involved in right now, we have partnered with librarians, authors against, banning books. We've got panels all across the state. And what they'll do is they'll send me an email, hey, do you have a religious speaker who can speak on the panel to defend freedom to read? Absolutely, right? Darren has been doing that, right? Because I know the people, right? That's our unofficial motto. I know a guy in Rhode in case you didn't know that. Because the reality is like, there's no possible way for me, I love Westerly, I love you all, but I can't go down there all the time, right? But we have Quakers in Westerly. I mean, and they're tougher than I am, right? They've been doing this a long time, so they're showing up and they're doing the work. So, you know, what our job at the council is to pull these threads together and then to activate folks in their communities, right? And to help them do that work, right? And then we can also pay attention to the kind of top level stuff that comes to the State House, right? Which is its own thing.
Hi, I just have a question about, do you think it's important for members of different faith communities to be going together with each other in person, to be sharing information and sharing a sense of how we can care for our community? And do you think it's important now for us to be both embodying the love of our faith communities with our community as a whole, and also to be the First Amendment that we support, the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom to petition our government, and the freedom to assemble and to actually embody that so that others in our community can see that. For example, on the second Saturday of every month for years, on the second Saturday of every month at 11 a.m. on Hope Street in Bristol, Rhode Island, the East Bay Citizens for Peace have been holding a silent vigil for 1 hour. Usually 5 or 6 people attend. But perhaps would you think that at this time in our nation's history, that might be an important thing to do, is to be seen as showing what the First Amendment looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think doing this in ecumenical interfaith spaces and to do it in public in ways that are authentic to the faith tradition are important. I mean, something that I personally participated in earlier this month and is ongoing, working with friends at Sojourners and something called WISC, which is like Washington Interfaith Staff Community. So all of the organizations that have representatives in Washington. We've organized something called Faithful Witness Wednesdays, where every Wednesday, starting on the Ash Wednesday, we've been at the Capitol, and it's been interfaith and people speaking from different faith traditions, calling on Congress to uphold their constitutional duty as a co-equal branch of government. And then there's been talk of expanding this to local communities. So that's just like an example, but I think this kind of presence, this kind of vigil presence, or protest presence in the community that's visible is an example of that kind of faith-based advocacy that I was mentioning earlier, and should be something to explore.
So I'm aware that it's time for us to move on to the next part, which is to worship together, right? As we think about the inspiration for today. I'm wondering if you might just leave us with your kind of final thought.
Oh.
No pressure.
Prepared for that. I'll just say it. I just am inspired every time I'm in a group of people. Like I just a deep sense of gratitude of all the things that are going on in your life. That you chose to spend several hours in community today to learn more about this topic, but also hopefully to meet people. Some people you already knew here today, some people that you're meeting for the first time. And to do, what did you call it, step 1A?
Step 1A.
Right. This is step 1A. Right? And so think about this as a continuing opportunity to grow this community. And cognizant that there are other groups like this that are meeting all around. How do we join better together in thinking we don't all have to agree on everything. Not everybody in this room agrees on everything. But maybe we all share a deep concern about how Christian nationalism is interfering with our pluralistic democracy, and for those of us who are Christians, with a faithful Christian witness. And can that be enough of a unifier for us to do really good and important work together that benefits everyone? And continuing to think about about a big tent philosophy about the kind of democracy that we're trying to build. And, you know, I loved the question. I'm not trying to disagree with you. I'm like, I love disagreement. Like, it's okay for us to disagree and for us to have tension about ways that we do the work. I think that's actually vital and a sign that we are having a pluralism in our midst. And for us to kind of continue to live up to, you know, that ideal that's never been fully realized or fully envisioned, but that there's great opportunity. It's not, and trust me, I'm not sugarcoating all of the horrible things that are happening, but there is actually, as things break down, there's opportunity to rebuild something that's never existed before. Those are my final words.
Thank you.